Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, deep into the world of unipolar depression. We'll be using the book Mood Disorders, a handbook of science and practice, and hopefully by the end, you'll know all there is to know.
Well, right away, you run into an interesting problem, actually. Like with a condition like, let's say, intellectual disability.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear cut. You either have it or you don't. But depression, not so much.
Yeah, so are you talking about that whole spectrum idea? It's not a simple yes or no, is it?
Right. And it's tough, especially like if you've only ever thought about depression as, you're diagnosed or you're not. It's a bit of a head scratcher. So think about those charts doctors use, like for a kid's development. Like there's a 90th percentile for height or whatever.
Right.
Depression is kind of like that.
Right.
So we've got these systems like the DSM and ICD. They try to categorize mental health conditions, but with depression, it's less about fitting into a neat little box and more like, where do you fall on this scale?
So it sounds like those systems aren't necessarily wrong. It's just that depression as a condition is a bit more fluid, a bit harder to pin down.
Exactly, yeah. Even seasoned clinicians, they might disagree sometimes. Like, do this person's symptoms fit neatly into depression? Or is it more of an anxiety thing? Sometimes it's a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, and then on top of that, there's the whole question of like who even experiences depression and how often? Where do we even begin with that?
Okay, so let's look at gender. Women are consistently more likely to experience depression than men. And no one really knows why. It could be hormones, could be societal pressures, it could be different coping mechanisms, probably. It's a mix of all these things. But here's the really interesting part. This gender difference is even stronger in married people.
Wait, married women are more likely to experience depression than single women. Really?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It shows how much we still don't know, And then there's age. Like we all joke about the midlife crisis, right? But the relationship between age and depression, way more complicated than that.
So it's not like everyone hits a certain age and bam, instant depression.
No, not at all. The rate doesn't just like steadily increase as we get older. It goes up, it goes down. But we do know that what happens early in life, it can have a really long-lasting impact, like childhood trauma, difficult family stuff. This kind of thing can make someone more susceptible to depression later on. And, here's the thing that always gets me. So many people who need help just don't get it. We call this the treatment gap.
That's pretty sobering, that there are people out there struggling and they aren't getting the support that they need. I think, this is why it's so important to actually talk about depression openly. Get rid of the stigma so people feel like they can ask for help.
Couldn't agree more. All right, ready to shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the brain. Like what's happening in there. This is where we get into the biology of it all.
Oh, the biology. Yeah, this is where it gets super fascinating for me. It makes you wonder, like, are some types of depression more biological than others? Is there a difference in the brain of someone with, like, severe melancholic depression versus someone with a milder case?
That is a fantastic question. And the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
There are probably differences, but it's incredibly nuanced. Let's start with genes, though, okay? Genes matter. We know that.
Yeah.
But it's not like one gene equals one disorder, right? It's more like your genes, they kind of create a vulnerability,
Yeah.
a susceptibility, but your experiences determine whether that actually turns into depression.
So it's like our genes provide the blueprint, but our experiences are like the contractor who comes in and builds the house.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your genes might make you more prone to depression, but whether you actually develop it and how it looks, it depends a lot on your life experiences, your environment, even your lifestyle choices, to be honest.
So genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, and our lifestyle choices, I guess, determine the impact.
I like that. That's great. And then beyond genes, you have this, this incredibly complex system in your body, the HPA axis. It controls your stress response.
Wait, is that the one with cortisol, that stress hormone everyone's talking about?
Yes. Cortisol is like the main character in the HPA axis story. And see, in a lot of folks with depression, this system, it's just out of whack. It's not working right. Some people, they even have chronically high cortisol. You call that hypercortisolemia.
So it's not just that, stress causes depression. It's that the biology of stress itself is actually contributing to the condition.
Exactly. And we've got to talk about neurotransmitters too, right? Those chemical messengers in your brain. Remember the old monoamine hypothesis?
Oh, yeah.
It said that depression was all about not having enough serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. Turns out it's not quite that simple.
So it's not just about how much of these chemicals you have, but more about how they're actually being used, how the brain's responding to them.
Right. And we got to think about the brain structure too, like its function. Brain imaging studies, they show us that people with depression often have some differences in certain areas,
Yeah.
like the hippocampus, that's involved in memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which helps with decision-making and stuff. There's even this model, it's called vascular depression. It connects changes in the brain's blood vessels with depression, but later in life.
Oh, wow. So even our physical health and those changes in the brain, that can actually play a role in depression, especially as we get older. It's probably not something a lot of people realize.
It's a super important connection to make. And bringing it back to your question about different types of depression, there's this idea of core depression, which says that some types, like melancholic depression, might be more biological. But then, on the other hand, you've got atypical depression, which is often linked with low cortisol.
Ah, that's interesting. It's almost like depression. It's kind of like a chameleon, you know?
Yeah.
It can show up in all these different ways depending on the person. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the biology. What about the mind? Like, how do our thoughts, our perceptions play into all of this? How does that internal chatter in our heads contribute to depression?
That's where we bring in something called cognitive models.
Uh-huh.
And one of the biggest ones is Beck's cognitive model. It's not only backed by a ton of research, it's also like the foundation of cognitive therapy,
Yeah.
which is really effective for treating depression.
Okay, so tell me more. What's going on in the minds of people who are dealing with depression according to this model?
So Beck, he came up with this idea called the negative cognitive triad. It's basically three things: negative views about yourself, about the world, and about the future. Imagine like you're constantly telling yourself, I'm worthless, the world's a terrible place, and nothing good will ever happen. You're basically looking at life through these super dark glasses.
And I'm guessing that leads to some pretty messed up thinking.
You got it. These are what we call cognitive distortions, like errors in thinking that just keep that negativity going, like overgeneralization, like I screwed up this one presentation, so I'm a total failure.
Yeah.
Or catastrophizing, which is like, I made a little mistake at work, I'm definitely getting fired. And then there's personalization. My friend seems grumpy, it must be something I did.
I think we all been guilty of those thinking traps at some point or another.
Oh, for sure. Beck's model also talks about schemas. So these are like deeply held beliefs about ourselves and our relationships, and they really shape how we see everything. Let's say, someone grew up with parents who were always criticizing them. They might develop this schema, this belief that says, I'm never good enough. And then that affects all their future relationships.
Oh, okay. I think it's important to point out, though, that this isn't saying depressed people are, like, illogical. It's more about this tendency to focus on the negative, especially when things are kind of ambiguous or uncertain.
Right on.
Yeah.
It's like their brains just latch on to that negative interpretation, even when there could be a positive one that's just as likely.
And this brings us to, I think, a really, really important part of depression, how it affects our relationships, our social lives.
Absolutely. Depression, it doesn't just stay locked in our heads. It spills out into how we interact with everyone and everything.
So let's get into that. What's actually going on in the social lives of people who are, dealing with depression?
There are two big things to think about. First, the amount of social interaction. It just goes down. People with depression, they tend to withdraw, to isolate themselves. Their social circles get smaller. They engage less with others. It's almost like their desire for connection has just disappeared.
So it's not that they don't like people or enjoy their company. It's more like their social battery is just always drained. Even the thought of interacting with someone feels exhausting.
Yeah, exactly. It's like their emotional reward system has been turned down, like way down. There was actually this study where they showed people with depression pictures of, smiling faces, and they were measuring their brain activity. And guess what? They had way less activity in the reward and pleasure centers of the brain compared to people without depression.
That's incredible. I mean, I can almost picture that, It really shows that emotional disconnects that can happen. So less quantity for sure, but what about the quality of the interactions? Does that change as well?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
Even when folks with depression are interacting, they might have a hard time with like negative communication patterns. Maybe they aren't very expressive, or they struggle to assert themselves, or they just get stuck dwelling on the bad stuff in their lives.
And this all just feeds into a vicious cycle, doesn't it? The more you withdraw, the more isolated you become, and that just fuels the negative thoughts and feelings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's this complex interplay of like biology, your thoughts, and social factors all tangled up together. It really makes you think, like if someone experiences depression as a kid or a teenager, does that set them up for a lifetime of struggles? Is it even possible to really recover? Can people break free from those patterns that are so deeply ingrained?
Yeah, and that's a question that I think hits close to home for a lot of people, especially for parents or caregivers who are seeing these signs in their children. So, what does the research say about the long-term outlook?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. On one hand, yeah, there's a pretty big risk that depression will come back, and those early episodes, they can have a lasting impact, almost like a scar. But there's also good news too. A lot of young people, they recover completely, especially if they get the right support. It seems like when the depression first shows up matters a lot. If it pops up later, like around puberty or after, there's a bigger chance it'll stick around into adulthood.
So there's hope, but it also shows us just how important early intervention is. Like taking those early signs seriously could really make a huge difference in preventing long-term struggles.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are you thinking so far? What's sticking out to you about depression?
Well, I think what's really striking me is just how multi-layered it is. It's not just a simple chemical imbalance or, a thinking problem. It's this whole tapestry woven from biology, psychology, our social environment, and, creating a completely unique experience for every single person.
I'm with you there. And it raises a really big question, I think. Like, if even those forms of depression that seem super biological can be affected by social stuff, what does that say about the mind-body connection? It's something to really chew on.
You know what? I think that's a great place to take a break. But don't go anywhere. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to zoom out even further. We're going to explore some evolutionary and integrative perspectives that might totally change how you think about depression.
Welcome back to our deep dive on depression. We were just talking about how biology, our thoughts, and social experiences, they all kind of weave together in this condition. But, let's zoom out a bit, like way out.
Zoom out. Okay, I like it. What's next? Where are we going?
We're going to explore where evolutionary biology meets psychology. Get ready. This is where it gets really cool. We're going to talk about the evolutionary roots of depression.
The evolutionary roots. Okay, gotta be honest, that sounds kind of counterintuitive. Depression, it seems so maladaptive, Like, how could something that makes us withdraw and feel hopeless possibly have any evolutionary advantages?
You've hit the nail on the head. Our modern perspective, it clashes with the logic of evolution sometimes.
Yeah.
Evolution, it doesn't care about our happiness, right?
Yeah.
It's all about survival and passing on genes. So what if, in certain situations, those behaviors that we see as part of depression, what if they actually helped our ancestors survive?
Okay, you're gonna have to explain that one. How could feeling down and withdrawn be good for survival? Help me picture it.
All right, imagine our ancestors, right? Out on the savannah. They suddenly run into a predator. Would charging at it head first be the best strategy? Probably not. Maybe a more cautious approach. Withdrawing, conserving energy, avoiding confrontation. That might have been the key to living another day.
So like a play dead kind of thing? Yeah, I can see how that would make sense in a, life or death scenario. But how does that relate to depression as we experience it today? We're not exactly dodging lions and tigers anymore.
Right, but that ancient wiring, it's still in us. Our source material, it has this chapter called Evolutionary Perspectives on Depression. It talks about this idea of involuntary defeat. Like, think about those times when you experience a huge setback, job loss, social rejection, feeling trapped, like there's no way out.
I'm following so far. But how does that connect back to depression being an evolutionary advantage?
Well, think about it. In those situations where you've lost something big or you've been defeated, does it really make sense to keep pushing forward? To keep using up all your energy and resources? Or maybe is it smarter to conserve energy, withdraw a little, and reassess things? The book suggests that maybe depression, in these contexts, it could be a way of signaling surrender, prompting others to help, or just preventing more harm by laying low.
So it's almost like depression is waving a white flag, like saying, I'm not a threat, or hey, I need help, or even this fight's not worth it, I'm better off saving my energy. Huh, that's really interesting.
It really makes you question that whole idea of depression just being a disorder, like something broken inside of you. Maybe, just maybe, it's this complex response that's deeply rooted in our evolutionary past.
It definitely makes you think. But how much of this evolutionary stuff, really applies to how we understand depression today? Our lives are so different from our ancestors, right? Do those same survival mechanisms still work in the modern world?
That's a good point. It's not about saying that every single case of depression is, because of these ancient survival instincts. But it does suggest that our brains and bodies, they still have those imprints. Even if the threats we face today are different, we still have the same basic brain structures, the same emotional pathways. They evolved to help us deal with challenges that were, a lot of the time, life or death.
So even though we're not running from saber-toothed tigers, our brains might react to, like, modern-day stressors, like losing a job or relationship troubles or being isolated in a similar way. Like, those things are just as threatening as a predator hiding in the bushes.
That's the idea. And it highlights how important it is to look at depression through a biopsychosocial lens. It's not just about what's happening in your brain
Wow.
or your thoughts or even in your social life. It's how all those things interact.
It's like a complex recipe, right? You need all the right ingredients in the right amounts to make the dish. And with depression, those ingredients, they include our biology, our psychology, our social world, and even a sprinkle of evolutionary history.
I love that. That's a great analogy. And it reminds us of something else that's important. Everyone reacts to stress differently. Some people get anxious, some people get angry, and some people, as we've been talking about, they experience those depressive symptoms. It's all part of being human, and it's shaped by both nature and nurture. So where do we go from here? We've explored biology, thoughts, social stuff, even went back in time to our evolutionary past. What else is there to consider when we're trying to understand depression?
Well, to me, the big question now is, what do we do about it? How do we actually treat depression with all this knowledge?
Right.
Is there some magic solution out there, like one thing that'll just make it all go away?
Yes, the search for the magic bullet.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if there was one simple fix? One medication, one therapy, and poof, depression's gone forever.
I think we all wish it was that easy, but I have a feeling you're going to tell me it's not. So is there even a right answer when it comes to treatment?
You know me too well.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, depression, like most things that are complicated, it needs a multifaceted approach to treatment.
Okay, no magic bullet. Bummer. But seriously, what does an effective treatment approach look like based on everything we've talked about?
The key is personalization. What works for one person might not work for another. We have to look at each person's needs, their situation, what they prefer. It's often a combination of things, carefully chosen to create a path to healing.
So it's about, like, weaving different threads of treatment together, medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, social support, to make something that's unique to that person.
Exactly. The solutions are just as complex as the causes.
Well, I think it's time to talk about those treatment options specifically. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore all the different strategies that are helping people deal with and overcome this really tough condition. From medication and therapy to lifestyle changes and beyond, we'll uncover the tools that are empowering people to reclaim their well-being. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've really been digging deep into the world of depression, haven't we?
We have. And now we get to the part where everyone wants to know, okay, so what can we do about it? How do we actually treat this thing?
It's the big question, right? After all that unpacking, what are our options? How do we move towards healing?
Well, the first thing to remember is there's no magic solution. Just like depression shows up differently for everyone, the road to recovery is different for everyone too.
Makes sense with everything we've learned. So where do we even start? What are, like, the most common ways to treat depression?
Usually the first thing we try, especially for moderate to severe cases, is medication, antidepressants. They basically work by boosting certain neurotransmitters in the brain. Remember those chemical messengers we talked about?
Yeah, like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine.
Exactly. So think of antidepressants like the big guns in the fight against depression.
Okay, so they're kind of like the heavy artillery.
Yeah, you could say that. But it's not as simple as just taking a pill and poof, everything's better. Antidepressants, they work differently for different people. And they can have side effects. It's super important to work with your doctor to find the right medication and the right dose, the combination that works best for you and that you can handle.
It's all about that balance, right? Getting the benefits, but also managing any side effects. But medication isn't the only option, is it? What about therapy?
Oh, absolutely. Therapy is huge. And a lot of times it's used alongside medication. And there are so many different kinds of therapy out there, each with its own approach and techniques.
So like a whole therapy buffet.
Pretty much.
Mm.
But let's focus on the ones that have the most research behind them, the ones we know really work. One of the most well-studied and widely used therapies is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT, I've heard of that.
Yeah. And CBT, it tackles those negative thought patterns and distortions head on. Remember, we talked about those.
Yeah, those thinking traps we all fall into sometimes.
Right. So CBT basically helps you rewire your brain to challenge those unhelpful thoughts and develop more balanced, realistic ways of thinking.
So it's about learning to step back, recognize those thoughts, and choose a different path. That sounds incredibly powerful. What other therapies are there?
Another really effective one is called interpersonal therapy, or IPT. This one focuses on your relationships and how you communicate with others.
So instead of going straight for the thoughts, it's looking at your social world and how your relationships might be affecting your mood.
Exactly. IPT recognizes that our relationships are a big part of our emotional health. It helps you figure out if there are any issues in your relationships that might be feeding into the depression, like conflicts, communication problems, or even changes in your roles in those relationships.
It's taking that bigger picture view, acknowledging that our mental health is tied to our connections with other people.
That's it. And there are other therapies out there too, like psychodynamic therapy. That one digs into those deeper unconscious patterns. And mindfulness-based therapies, those focus on being present and accepting what is. And even newer ones, like acceptance and commitment therapy or ACT, that one's all about values and being flexible.
Wow, so many options. It sounds like the best choice really depends on the person, how severe their depression is, and what their specific challenges
You
are.
got it. And it's not just about therapy and meds either. Lifestyle changes can make a huge difference too.
Right, because our physical health and our mental health, they're totally connected. So what kind of lifestyle changes are we talking about? Spill the beans.
Exercise is a big one. It actually has antidepressant effects. It can lift your mood, lower stress, and even help you sleep better.
So those endorphins they always talk about, those are real.
Oh yeah, they're real. And speaking of sleep, getting enough good quality sleep is essential. Depression can really mess with your sleep. So try to have a regular sleep schedule, a relaxing bedtime routine, and avoid caffeine or alcohol before bed. Those can really make a difference.
And what about diet? I'm guessing that plays a role too.
Absolutely. Eating healthy, lots of fruits and veggies, whole grains, it gives your brain the nutrients it needs to work its best. And cutting back on processed foods, sugary drinks, and unhealthy fats can be good for your mind and body.
So it's all about giving your mind and body what they need to heal and thrive.
I like that. And don't forget about social connection. Remember those appetitive deficits we talked about? Well, fighting social isolation is a huge part of recovery.
Yeah, makes sense. Even if it feels hard to reach out when you're down, connecting with people you care about, joining a support group, or doing social activities can really help. It reminds you that you're not alone in this.
Exactly. There are other things you can try too. Spending time in nature, doing something creative, practicing gratitude, finding healthy ways to manage stress. It's about building a life that supports your mental well-being.
Wow, we've covered a lot. It's a lot to process, but what really sticks out to me is that there is hope. There's a way forward, no matter how tough things feel right now.
I agree. Recovering from depression is a journey. It's about learning how to navigate the ups and downs, becoming more resilient, and finding ways to thrive even when things are hard. It's about figuring out what works for you and building your own personal toolkit for well-being.
That's a great way to put it. To our listener who's on this journey or who knows someone who is, I hope this deep dive has given you some insights, some new ways of looking at things, and most importantly, some hope. Remember, you are not alone. There's help out there. Reach out, find support, and keep moving forward.
And for anyone who found this whole exploration fascinating and wants to learn more, I highly recommend checking out Mood Disorders, a handbook of science and practice. It's full of great information. And remember, understanding is often the first step on the road to healing.
That's all for this deep dive, everyone. Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep those minds active. Until next time, stay curious.